Good evening, everyone. Good evening. How are you doing? This is another episode, a live episode of The Left Lens. As you can see, I am joined by Margaret Kimberly. How are you doing this evening, Margaret?
I'm good. Nice to be back.
And of course, we are joined today, as the title suggests, by Chairman of the African People Socialist Party, Omali Yeshitela. Good evening, Omali. How are you?
Uhuru, I'm quite well. Thank you so much for having me.
Great. It's great to have you. So before we get into questions, though, make sure you're hitting that like button in order to boost this stream in the algorithm. Make sure more people are hearing about Mali and the African People's Socialist Party's case, because this is a very important issue. And I just want to kick it to you, Omali, to talk about what's happened here, because back in July, there was an FBI raid of your house and also of several other complexes related to the work that you and your members and your allies are all a part of. So what happened and where are we now with it? Could you give our viewers an idea and understanding of what's going on?
Well, I want to thank you very much, first of all, for allowing us access to this platform to be able to speak to your viewers and listeners, and helping us to escape also from this kind of trap of a news cycle that something happens and then it goes away. The next important thing, Chris Rock gets slapped or something like that, takes the spotlight and it goes away. I think it's really important to have this discussion because what happened was on 5 a.m. pre-dawn on July 29th here in St. Louis, and then 6 o'clock on Eastern time in St. Petersburg, Florida. Our offices and homes and headquarters came under assault. My wife and I were sitting up planning the day. She was planning to initiate this doula program where 14, 15 African women were coming together at our Uhuru house here in St. Louis to begin the process of becoming doulas, and then after that to learn how to even operate businesses as doulas. And in St. Louis, we face a situation where in the African community, something like enough Black babies die the first year of life to fill 15 classrooms. So it's a really important project that we involved in. That's one of the number of projects that we involved in terms of economic and other kinds of development for our community. And then out of the night, this booming sound, startling sound, saying that the people at this address should come out of the house and that we should come out with our hands up and nothing in our hands. And this is the FBI. And this is repeated and over again. At first, we weren't sure what we were hearing out of the, you're not expecting to hear a voice like that out of the night. And then as this voice is being repeated, these flashbang grenades are going off out throughout the surrounding area, throughout my house, around my house, in the neighborhood. And we were to later discover that they were actually igniting these setting these grenades off in the back stairwell of the house itself. So I went downstairs and asked my wife to get on the phone and to wait and come after me and to let everybody know that we were being attacked. And she tried to do that, but she learned that our phones were jammed and we couldn't communicate with anybody. So I went down the stairs, and when I got downstairs, I was confronted with an armored vehicle in front of my house and a number of military forces and carrying assault weapons that were mounted with laser targeting device that they deliberately had bouncing off my chest, the laser beams hitting me in the chest to make it clear that they could kill me. It was like a threat on my life, a terroristic kind of threat from their perspective. And I did expect they would kill me because I'm thinking Fred Hampton and Mark Clark, what they did at 4 o'clock in the morning on December 4th, 1969. And so I go downstairs, and my wife follows me. And as she exits the door, a drone sweeps past her house, past her head, going up the stairs of the house. And I get downstairs, and I'm greeted by these militarily attired, camouflage, wearing assault weapon toting armed forces, and they they call me to come toward them. There's lights, there in my face and whatever, and I move toward them. And when I get there, they put zip ties. They zip tie me behind my hands behind my back. My wife came later, and they handcuffed her behind her back. And I'm saying, what is this about? What's going on? And they tell me eventually that there's some kind of indictment that's coming down against a Russian national who's in Russia, and that should he ever come to the United States, he would be arrested, and that my name came up in the indictment, and there was a warrant. They had a warrant to search my house. I asked them to see the warrant, and they said that they didn't have it with them. Or he didn't, the guy who was talking to, that it was somewhere in the vicinity, but he couldn't show it to me. And they couldn't show me the indictment because it was going to be released later that morning in Tampa, Florida. So we engaged in, brief struggles around this question, why am I handcuffed? If to protect me, they said I was handcuffed for my own protection. I should sit on the curb, they said. And this humiliating thing that you see happening every day in the African community, mostly with young Africans, but Black people, handcuffed, sitting on the curb, and what have you. It's actually a posture of complete defeat and humiliation. That's what they wanted to impose on me, and I didn't do that. And they asked my wife to do the same thing, and she refused to do it. And then they said, well, you can sit in the car. We don't want to sit in the car. We don't want to have anything to do with this. We want to leave. And so eventually, after struggling with them, I'm saying, well, can we leave? Are we under arrest? No, can we leave? Yes, you can leave. So I asked them to cut the zip ties off from me. They took my cell phone from me, and they took my wife's phone. And then they went into my house, and they stayed there for hours, ransacking the house. I was to learn that they stole laptops and other kinds of electronic devices from that house. At the same time, this is in St. Louis, and I'm inviting you, by the way, both of you and your viewers and listeners. You should come to St. Louis, because I lived in the most economically depressed sector in St. Louis, in North St. Louis, in 44 Redbud, 44 Bud. It's referred to. It's an extraordinarily impoverished, economically depressed sector of the African community. It's been some improvements have been made recently because of our presence and things that we've done to change the community, but it was extraordinary. So this is in the majority African section of St. Louis, on South St. Louis, where the majority of the white people live. They also attacked our building, the African People's the Solidarity Center, which headquarters the work of a solidarity component of our party, and mostly white people, effectively. And there's a big banner there calling for unity through reparations, and there are all kinds of supporters of our movement there as well. And they go upstairs. They use the flashbang grenades. They use battering rams and knock in the steel doors. And then they go through the apartments upstairs. They handcuffed the two young people, one of whom is now also characterized, Jesse Neville, as a unindicted co-conspirator with the Russian who is, they say, the target of this thing, but obviously it can't be the target. I don't think they're going to invade Russia and to arrest this guy. And then they go to and so they steal materials there as well. They go to the houses of Penny Hess, another unindicted co-conspirator, and Kitty Riley, and they knock in doors, windows. They steal devices and things like that from them as well. In St. Petersburg, Florida, where I was born and lived, and have done a tremendous amount of political work over the years. They went to my house in St. Petersburg, Florida, which nobody's living there because I'm living in St. Louis, but they busted into that house. There are photos, videos you can see of them coming out of the house. There are literally scores of them at that house. And they do the same thing in terms of taking electronic devices. They shut down the community in St. Petersburg as they do in St. Louis, Missouri. And then they went to the home of Akilia Nai, one of the young leaders and increasingly prominent face of our movement, who's responsible for our work around information development and distribution. Runs our radio station and other things. And I should mention, when they went to her house, they knocked on the door. They had the St. Petersburg Police Department knock on the door, and they told her that someone was breaking into her car, that she should come out and investigate. And so when she comes out of the house, then she's surrounded by FBI agents who come from behind vans and things like that. They take her cell phone. They attempt to begin interrogating her as well. At the Uhuru House in St. Petersburg, Florida, where they used battering rams, they knock in doors, they took our radio station temporarily off the air. They went up to our archives where we have perhaps 50 years or more of archived materials from our party, from our movement, and from other things that had been happening in the world and in the country, and they took some materials from there as well. So it was a vicious raid that brought attention to us, that brought us to awareness that the FBI, the federal government, United States government, has begun to use the kind of intensive blatant attacks on our movement today that we hadn't seen since the 1960s in terms of the assault on the African liberation movement. We didn't, but it helped to put some other things in place for us. For example, on July 2nd, some 27 days before this attack that I'm talking about now, someone pulled into the parking lot of our building in St. Petersburg, Florida, the Uhuru House. And they went in the trunk in broad daylight. They opened the trunk, and we caught this on the security videos. And somebody was upstairs in the building when they saw this, when this happened, and was able to see some of this. And they opened the trunk and they pulled a military grade flamethrower from the trunk of the car. And then they walked over to we have a 50-foot flagpole. With a 15 by 25 foot red, black, and green flag flying there. And they used this flamethrower to torch it. I mean, this is not like a barbecue, starter or something like that. This was a flamethrower. And we were able to capture the license plate and things like that. And the police came, and Homeland Security came, and FBI came. A host of police organizations came, and eventually they said it was a 19-year-old African man who they said just stated disgust passing that flag every day, and that he hated socialists, and so he torched it, and so they couldn't charge him with anything, they said, except criminal mischief. And so, not even arson for burning the flag. And so we've come to connect that, and partially because even as they attacked us in St. Louis in a very obvious way, and on July 29th, and St. Petersburg in a very obvious way on July 29th. And they said out loud, "This is the FBI who's doing this." They didn't say that on July 2nd. But then later in October, we had gone into negotiations to purchase a huge church that had been empty for a long time. It's right across the street, in fact, from my house in St. Louis. And we had actually had it under contract. We were going to be able to put a lot of the different programs that we have initiated in St. Louis in that church. So we initiated that process in October. October 31st, they came to one of our properties next to the Uhuru House in St. Louis, where we had done a Halloween thing for the young people, for the children. And as this member of our organization was taking down the decorations, this is something like 11 o'clock or noon. Two law enforcement personnel roll up on him, handcuff him, put him on his knees, and lock him up, and put him in the car, and said that they're arresting him because he made terroristic threats. So we don't, this is in October. And then in January, the church that the same month we're negotiating for the church. And then in January, the church is torched, burned. I mean, just taking it out of action altogether. And the brother who was arrested on October 31st, his government colonial name is Javon Gammon. And they told him, again, they were arresting him because he made terroristic threats. And the terroristic threats had to do with an argument that he got with the school board, the school district, because he had been given a job. He had worked as a teacher, and a part-time teacher, and they had ostensibly hired him to work full-time. And then suddenly they withdrew that. And so he gets into an argument with somebody on the phone and through email around that question. And so they said, that's what the terroristic threats are. So he gets to jail, and they tell him once he gets to jail, he sits there for something like 7 hours. Nobody pays any attention to him. He watches people who are arrested and from where he is positioned in this holding cell and get processed for 7 hours. This goes on. And then finally, these two individuals who identify themselves as a Fed and as a local cop, and they come and said, we know that these charges about terrorism, they are BS, there's nothing to it, it's garbage, etc. What we want to talk to you about is Russia. And they want to talk to him about Russia because I had been to Moscow, and because he had been to Moscow with me. And so they held him for 2 weeks. 2 weeks they had him locked up before we had to spend money for lawyers. We spent something like $40,000 repairing the damages, replacing materials they've stolen. Even at my house, my home here in St. Louis, they broke windows. As I mentioned, they exploded flashbang grenades in the rear stairwell. They wreaked havoc. And so that's what happened. And now we've been faced with a situation where we have to raise a whole bunch of money. We've got a minimum of 4 people that we can clearly identify that they have been characterized as unindicted co-conspirators. We have faced with just raising money to pay lawyers alone. Like I said, we spent $40,000 just on repairing damage and replacing equipment that they stole from us. So we figured that we have to spend a minimum of $270,000 or so just in legal fees, just for those people. And that's wide open, because those are just some of the people they have not identified that we, and as part of the unindicted co-conspirators, but they have put our entire organization, our entire movement in that category of being non-indicted co-conspirators. So one objective clearly is to bleed the organization, to stop the programs that we initiate. We have something like more than 50 economic development and Black Power programs stretched across this country. Many of them here in St. Louis, and they're in other places as well. Like I mentioned, in St. Petersburg, Florida, there are some. We have economic development program in Huntsville, Alabama, and Houston, Texas, in the Washington D.C. area. Because self-determination is, we firmly believe in self-determination, and they want to destroy that and destroy our capacity, because to the extent that we are successful with these programs, it is without necessarily having to say so, it's a criticism of the inability and unwillingness of the United States government to take on these issues. Where we feed, clothe, and house people, we create processes through which people can come together to solve our own problem. They call it food deserts. We say power desert. In St. Louis, we've created farmers market here. We've created farmers market in Philadelphia. Well, we created a market in Philadelphia that's been 12, 13 years old there in Philadelphia, where 90 to 100 African people come and vend and feed their families as a consequence of that. And thousands of people come through every year to participate in that. So our existence and the relative success that we have is an unspoken criticism of the colonial power that dominates the lives of African people. So those are some of the things that, in terms of where we are now, we are dealing with this legal question. We've created a magnificent committee, the Hands Off Uhuru Committee, that has organized this fight back. We're not just moving at from some kind of defensive posture. We characterize it as a counteroffensive that we are engaging them in. So I know that was a pretty long-winded kind of response to your opening, but that's sort of where we are.
Well, thank you, Omali. That was, but that's the information that people need. Everyone watching is not familiar with these events, but I hope everyone is familiar with the targeting of Black people by law enforcement. You mentioned the ways in which people are mistreated by local law enforcement, and the fact that movements have been targeted by the federal government. Everybody knows about COINTELPRO, and it's important for people to know that this has not ended. Right at this moment, the charges of Russian interference and collusion, that's what's being used now. But some of it's just old-fashioned stuff like arresting the person you mentioned, keeping him in jail for 2 weeks, trying to get him to be a snitch. I guess that's the best way to describe it. So I think it's important for everyone to be reminded that we are going to be targeted when we act in solidarity and when we challenge the system in any way.
Yeah. Let me tell you, from our perspective, if I may, part of what is happening is that we think that many people have misidentified what the profound contradiction in this world, in this country, is. We know that many people who are progressives, and some of whom are Marxists and what have you, consider the place where we are in history is contending with what might be characterized as a capitalist mode of production. And we think that's a mischaracterization. That what we're looking at is a colonial mode of production. We're looking at this thing that Karl Marx talked about, where he talked about the primitive accumulation of capital. That was the thing that turned Africa into a warrant for the commercial hunting of black skins. And he talked about India and the brutal assault that was being made on the East Indies and India, and on the what's now characterized as the Americas. This is the foundation that he said of the capitalist system. He said that this primitive accumulation, as he identified it, has the same significance in political economy as original sin in theology. And we think that's right, except that it's a mischaracterization, because what Marx was doing was defining a system that was born and impacting Europe and European people mostly. But the fact is that what this system came into being through colonial terror, through 600 years ago, Portugal leaving Portugal and initiating the trade in black people, and what came, and for the first time in history, contributing to the emergence of a world economy, not just people around the world, within the world, trading with each other, but a world that was connected to a single economy. That was colonialism that did that. That was a foundation for what has come to be known as the capitalist system. And that the crisis that we continue to see. I mean, if you look around and throughout history, where the socialist revolution was supposed to happen, it didn't. And, it happened in the most unlikely places, even if you include Russia, Vietnam, Cuba, all of these different places. And that's because it's the colonial mode of production. It's the fundamental contradiction that people are confronted with, and that today, even as you see Russia, China, and the United States contending, and this is for the first time since the 1940s, since the 1960s, that the U.S. has had to contend with any other force in the world for leadership, for influence, etc., with the reemergence of Russia. Now we see that happening with the intervention of China, and we see this great contest. Much of it is concentrated in Africa. That's why you have, for the first time in history, 246-year history, the United States Marines, for the first time, got a 4-star general. And they put him in charge of what? But they call it AFRICOM. And that's the purpose of controlling Africa and contending with Russia, China, and Africans in Africa. For the first time in its history, they got an African former general as head of what they call a Defense Department. And I think this is where we're seeing all of these contradictions revealing themselves in a certain way. But unfortunately, it's invisible to many people who don't recognize the significance of Africans and Africans and the colonized peoples of the world, and actually believe that the future of the world is going to be determined by the United States, or the contest between the United States and China and or Russia. And the rest of us don't, have any meaningful kinds of consequence. We think they're wrong, and we think that the African People Socialist Party, we have created organizations in Africa, in some of the critical places in Africa, like South Africa. We're in Namibia. We're in Swaziland. We're in Botswana. We are also in a minor way, like in Nigeria. We're in certain French-speaking components, Benin of Africa. We're in the Caribbean and throughout the United States and Europe. Now, we're a small organization. This is not boastful speaking at all. What I'm just saying is that we are putting together an organization, and for the first time since the movement of Marcus Garvey, the organization that the FBI cut its teeth in its development, for the first time, there is an all-African actual revolutionary movement on the ground, organizing African people throughout the African world. And I think that's extremely problematic, especially when you recognize that Africa, that there's not a single modern economy on earth that can function without resources coming from Africa, and that the African people in the United States have always been fundamental, a most consistent, fundamental revolutionary force, to the point that, as you know, in 1969, J. Edgar Hoover who catches a lot of flack as the FBI, as the head of the FBI, declared that the Black Panther Party represent the greatest internal threat to the security of the United States since the Civil War. And that's how African people are understood. That's how we are understood to be meaningful. And so I think it's deep and profound. I think we live in a country where people don't even mention the fact of these concentration camps that euphemistically call Indian reservations, where the indigenous population have been pushed into and live under horrible circumstances with lifespans in the 30s in the United States. People don't remember that half of Mexico was stolen in 1848. And the Mexicans, as you know, the illegals and characterized as being responsible for critical immigration issues and questions, et cetera. Of course, the immigration question, if you want to characterize it as such, is white people. I mean, this is, you have a situation where they come and they take the land and the people and establish a colonial, it's a settler colony that controls not only controls the world. And it's experiencing a serious crisis right now. And the crisis is such that to the extent that peoples are successful in challenging the hegemony of the United States, where Africans are successful, where people in Venezuela and Nicaragua and Cuba and Afghanistan and other places around the world are successful or approximate some element of success, it creates economic crisis within the United States. And these economic crises in the United States result in political crisis in the United States. So that the colonizer, white people who are accustomed to having things their way begin to move in a fashion that actually challenges the validity of the government itself. So that you see, like mobs of white people attacking the Capitol, defecating in the hallowed halls of the Capitol, chasing the vice president with the intent to hang him, they say. It's a extraordinary situation that we're looking at, where the social fabric of the United States, based on colonial domination of Africans and other peoples around the world, is coming apart. And this is part of what it is that we're looking at. And as I was talking to you earlier, Sister Margaret, before we came on, that it's a situation where the oppressor cannot do anything right. And it's a situation where, it's just a crisis-ridden contradiction, and it drives them to what, a certain kind of irrationality. And certainly it appears to be a certain kind of irrationality, like on the surface. So it doesn't make sense what they do. And that's problematic too, Yeah.
Well, what you were describing earlier too, with what happened to you and the African People Socialist Party in St. Louis and in St. Petersburg, it sounded like war. I mean, you were describing a condition of war. We are also in a moment, and all of this has happened amid the U.S.'s proxy war in Ukraine, which has accelerated and magnified this kind of anti-Russia hysteria, and really this what some would call a new McCarthyism, but I believe that it's been really just an extension of the same repression that you had described, of the Black Liberation Movement, of the communist movement. Could you talk about the connection of what happened and what's happening at this moment to you and your organization, and what is transpiring around the world? Because as you said, there is this kind of unraveling, this crisis. It's geopolitical, it's international in nature. What's the connection here?
I think that's a really important question, because some people may remember that the current troubled expression of the existing world order is something that was consolidated with treaty after the end of the Second Imperialist World War, called World War II. And this is where we saw the Atlanticist bloc emerge, and things like the United Nations and NATO and World Bank and International Monetary Fund and various other kind of trade relationships. This is where this whole thing came together, and where a certain block of imperialist forces dominated the world, and dominated certainly the colonial world. And it's really interesting because at one point, even sectors of the imperialists, they're trying to find a better way, like elections themselves are nothing but nonviolent contests between sectors of the ruling class for control of the state, to their own, economic benefit. And we saw at one point, even Obama was talking about making the pivot, like to the east. And this was, something that, stuck his toe in the water and talked about doing something. But the one who really made that move, of course, was Trump. If you remember, Trump came out attacking, most of the manifestations of the Atlanticist bloc. The United Nations came out hard on the United Nations, NATO, all these folks in the various kind of trade relationships that were created, that define this Atlanticist bloc. And of course, what you saw in Trump was a group of on the make a kind of capitalist hustlers, trying to intervene and in a contest with the Atlanticists, a serious contest with the Atlanticists. That's why you saw that everybody who was with Trump, who they jailed, especially part of his administration tied to Russia in some way, Russia money, Russia economics, because they saw in Russia this means of tying into the Russian, especially energy component and the other possibilities they saw connected to Russia. Not necessarily something that they saw. They didn't see this as something necessarily benefiting Russia, but they thought they could penetrate it in the same way that Atlanticists have dominated the rest of the world, and they would challenge the Atlanticists from that perspective. And they got beat up on in a fashion I've never seen any politician, any president, regardless of how ridiculous and weird they may be, under such an assault as we saw happen with the Trumps. There was not a single day for his time he was in power that he was not under assault. And so I think that's part of the unraveling that we're looking at. I think that we see like a lot of different forces, cross current of different forces fighting to find advantage in a very troubled kind of political and economic situation. I think we're witnessing a real transformation in the political and economic configuration of the world economy right now. I think that's relatively obvious. I mean, the wars in Afghanistan, all these other places are means by which the traditional colonial powers are trying to hold on to something. And then you see movement by forces like Russia and China in their own interests, and even Iran, forces who are breaking free from the traditional colonial mode of production, if you will, this colonial domination that contains the world, and that's who's on the attack. And so you have America that defines itself now, not the capitalists against the communists as it was defined in the past, but the democracy led by the United States. Democracies fighting autocracies headed by Russia and China, and then there's Iran, and then there's all these other forces. And of course, they're starving people in Afghanistan right now. They took all their money and what have you, and they're responsible for all kinds of sabotage and contradictions, as they are in Iran now. They're doing in Afghanistan, Iran, mayhem, sabotage, and things like that. So I think there's a whole transformation that's going on of a reconfiguration of the world, of the political and economic world that we live in. I think that's part of what we're looking at, and I think there's a scrambling that's happening. And the fact is that from stuff I've been able to pick up on is that the vast majority of the people of the world do not unite with this narrative that's been created by the United States in terms of the Ukraine Russia confrontation. And from our perspective, this started a long time ago, much earlier than 2014. From our perspective, this is something that happened in 1918. When all of the colonial powers, including the United States and Japan, invaded Russia right after the Russian Revolution. It was communist Russia then. It was Soviet Russia then. And this communist Russia, this Soviet Russia, was something that became communist and Soviet Russia in part because, unlike the rest of the European communists and socialists, they refused to participate in a war to redivide the world. That is to say, to redivide the colonized peoples of the world. And this is happening at the same time. You have this incredible movement led by people like Marcus Garvey. Revolution happened in Nicaragua. Struggles of oppressed people all around the world happening. And then there's this Russia that's broken ranks and declared itself the center of the revolutionary movement of working people everywhere. And this is where you see this invasion, a literal invasion of Russia by all of the colonial powers, like I said, including Japan and the United States. And there has been an ongoing attack on Russia with only what appears to be pause at the time of the Second Imperialist World War. And even that was appearance, because part of the objective for a while during that time was to stand back and let Russia and Germany destroy each other. The United States took a long time before it even entered in that process. And of course, Russia lost, 50 million people or so in that war, and actually was the force that defeated Nazi Germany. So anyway, we're looking at a world that has an origin. The way the world economy functions, the way what has been defined as how do they characterize it? This world order is something. The immediate configuration again stemmed from that Second Imperialist World War and all the treaties and all the institutions and organizations that were created subsequent to that. And how that's being busted up, and that's causing mayhem and various kinds of crises. And I think we're in the middle of that. I think that when I say we, African People Socialist Party, Black people, I think especially colonized peoples around the world. I mean, you're talking about you can't resolve certain kinds of contradiction without fierce, serious crisis. For the existence of the social system in the United States itself. And I know that many people have problems believing in the potential of a movement by that struggles to resolve the contradiction of indigenous people called Indians and Mexicans, whose lands, half of Mexico, is stolen. Haiti being starved now. The most fundamental attack that's ever made on the capitalist system happened with the Haitian Revolution, where the whole world economy revolves immediately around slavery. And Haiti busted it up and then declared that any slave on earth, you get to Haiti, you can be free. And they've been under assault since that time. I mean, the situation is that it's always been more tenuous. Colonial rule has always been more tenuous than the flag waving, patriots, whether it's a Trump or a Biden, would make it appear. And if you look at Biden, he was mentioned recently, and his influence in particular became really significant subsequent to the emergence of the Black Revolution of the 1960s. Because Biden is one who, of course, his stand around things like busing and integration that all the liberals said they wanted and what have, and Biden led to the assault against this. But more than that, Biden is the one who initiated this omnibus crime bill that allows him to get down on one knee and say Black Lives Matter on the one hand, while he's the reason that people are wondering if it does matter or not, because he's the one who unleashed all these cops. I mean, the cop who murdering people around this country, Biden is the one who pumped them out with Bill Clinton, who put 100,000 cops in the community with a not so subtle message to white people that they would contain Black people in this country. And, so this whole thing is unraveling. And right now, I think it's really important for us to say that Biden, it's the administration of Biden, the liberal. It's the administration of the Democratic Party that attacked my home, that has put forth this whole notion that Black people are so stupid that we've suffered this contradiction of white power and brutality and murder and humiliation all these years. But it took somebody who they consider white to tell us that we oppress, and therefore the Russian must have told us to do this, that told us to fight against genocide, told us to get involved in elections demanding reparations. This is the nonsense that we hear coming from them, but it's something that is more than nonsense, and everybody should really be offended by that, and especially liberals, and especially people who have some kind of affinity for the Democratic Party and Joe Biden and all of them, in the Democratic Party. I don't know. I've probably talked all around what the issue that you raised initially, but I think those are some of the things that needed to be mentioned. But I'm prepared to follow your leadership. Just go ahead and pursue that. Yeah.
Thanks, Omali. You mentioned Biden, and we're just a year away from another presidential election. This quadrennial hoax played on people in this country, and as we see things unravel around the world, here at home, you can't separate the domestic from the international. So we will see them. They keep trying to prop this up, and they do a good enough job that they get people to come out in droves. I mean, it was a record number of people voting the last time. But I wonder, and I'm not asking you to be to read fortunes or anything, read the future. Given everything that's going on now, and we can see their desperation in who's going to run and who's going to keep the ship from sinking a little longer. What do you want Black people in particular to know about these electoral processes and what it is we should really be paying attention to?
I think a real problem that we are confronted with is that people do not recognize alternatives. I don't think people vote for Trump or for certainly not for Biden and the Democratic Party because they like Biden and the Democratic Party. I think that they Africans vote for Biden out of fear. They were scared of Trump. And that's how it's been for the longest period of time. The Republicans are somebody that we are afraid of. And so we run to the Democrat Party hoping that it's going to rescue us. I think that at the time, the Black liberation movement was strong. When the Black Panther Party, for example, was strong, and when there could be independent activity, independent of the Democratic Party, where people could express their views and pursue their interests, I think it was different. I want to remind you that in 1965, the universal suffrage was supposed to have occurred in this country because of the passage of the Voting Rights Act. But I think it's really important to remember that when you talk about 1965 passage of the Voting Rights Act, and I was one of those people who worked throughout, especially Florida, registering and getting and educating people about the voter registration process. In fact, I worked under the leadership of what's the guy's name who had Monica Lewinsky's dress, the African who was over the Urban League at one point. Anyway, I worked under his leadership in one of the voter education anti-poverty programs, anti-voter education and something like that program, Brennan Jordan. And the point is that at the same time, they were talking about voter universal suffrage in this country. Something else was happening that I think may be missed by a lot of people. In 1965, the very year that the Voting Act voter thing was passed, they killed Malcolm. In 1968, they killed King, who had this massive campaign, a poor people's campaign. 1969, they killed Fred Hampton. They were assassinating and killing people, destroying our capacity to make a struggle in our own interest. That was fundamental to everything they did. So by the time the Voting Rights Act seemed to have some significance, we had nobody to vote for, and we had no organization that controlled the independent aspirations or spoke to the independent aspirations of African people. Therefore, the Party of African People was no longer the Black Panther Party. It was no longer JOMO that I was a part of. It was no longer SNCC or anything like that. It was a Democratic Party. And so this became the organization. This is the basis for what we've seen in terms of a lot of African people who may have turned out, but they turned out because there's no alternative, and fewer people, too few people from the perspective of many Africans turn out, many leaders come out to vote. And the reason is that people are disgusted because nothing changes. And nothing changes because they've killed those change agents, destroyed the organization that provide change agent that leads towards some kind of change, and then left you with the Democratic Party. That's why they would attack the African People Socialist Party, because we use the electoral process as well. And the thing that we did with the electoral process, we put stuff on the electoral agenda that had been taken off the agenda with the assassinations of Malcolm, destruction of the Black Panther Party, and things like that. So for the first time in the history of this country, reparations made on the ballot, we did it. That is to say, the African People Socialist Party, who were moving in St. Petersburg, Florida, in 2017. That's part of what they are charging us with. That's part of the unindicted stuff, because the Russians told us to do that, according to them. And of course, after we did, that's the first time Barack Hussein Obama ever got involved in a local election. He came and actually endorsed the opponent, our opponent in that race. Because of that. And so this is part of what it is that we're looking at, that they don't want us to have independent leadership. They say you can vote, but just vote for what we want you to vote for, put what we want on the ballot. And we also created this entity through the Black is Back Coalition of an electoral school where we train people how to participate in an election, but not just the techniques. We also provide political education, ideological development, and stuff like that. And every year we do that, and we got one coming up in April from the 7th through the 9th. So I think these contribute to the contradiction. And finally, we are convinced that the way forward is that Black people are going to have to take our own power over our own lives. So we're not going to find it that means we have to have an organizational capacity to do that. And that's what the African People Socialist Party is about. That's why we create these institutions. We create what we call dual and contending power, so that Black people begin to create our own power, and to the extent we have power, it erodes the power of the colonizer in our life and our lives. And I think that's part of why we attack. And we go to the community, we go in the streets, we go door to door into the houses of the people, taking political education and organization. And there's a lot that we have to do, and there's a lot that we haven't done, and we're not as good at it as we want to be, but we're getting better every day. And I think that's one of the reasons we came under attack. So the response to your question is that we have to fight to have an independent capacity. That's why there's a national Black political agenda for self-determination that we were able to put together through the Black is Back Coalition for Social Justice. Power in our own hands. That's the only way. And we can make all kinds of relationships with people once we have an agenda of our own that allows us to go into any kind of relationship. And that agenda has to be founded on some scientific appreciation of the contradictions that we face as a people, which we are convinced is critical to the whole world emancipation from capitalist colonialist domination. All the working people of the world, we think the future of the colonial peoples of the world is concentrated in the struggle for Africa and African liberation. We think that the situation we are confronted with, where 80% of the people on the planet Earth are trying to survive of less than $10 US a day or $12 US a day, but 50% of the people on the planet Earth are trying to survive off $2.50 a day. And if you're in Africa, you're trying to just a meal a day, you're lucky if you get that. That's something horribly wrong with that. And that's the vast majority of the people. That's not the 99% that I hear people talking about. That's not the 99%. That's the vast majority of colonized people who are feeding this tiny majority of the world's population who live at our expense. And of course, on top of that is the ruling class who does everything it can to solve the problems of the masses of white people, so that they maintain a loyalty to the system. But that's fracturing in a very serious way. We have white people working under our leadership in 141 cities in this country, working for reparations, taking out the program of the African People Socialist Party in 141 cities. These are just white people. I'm not even talking about the members of the organizations tied directly to the African People Socialist Party or to the International People's Democratic Uhuru Movement and other entities like that.
Well, Omali, it was really great having you. I think you gave us a lot of food for thought. I wanted to, though, before you leave, pull up the emergency response from a form from the Hands Off Uhuru campaign that you mentioned earlier. So you can go here. The link is in the description, and there's a way to sign a pledge. Do you want to talk about ways people can support this campaign and anything else before you go? And before everyone else, don't leave. Margaret and I are staying on after Omali departs. But Omali, I'll kick it to you.
I just want to thank you very much, first of all, like I said, for having us, because what's really important is to break out of this sort of isolation silo that they would keep us into, Zuckerberg and the rest. So I want to appreciate that. And I want people, if you would, to go to Hands Off Uhuru. That's UHURU.org, handsoffuhuru.org. And you can find all the information involving this counter offensive that we are waging. Because what has to happen is every attack on us has to be something that exposes them. There's no way they can charge us with being Russian agents without having to explain the conditions of African people in this country, the history of that. I mean, even Joe Biden in December, speaking before 49 so-called heads of state in this so-called U.S. Africa summit, had to make some feeble gesture at apologizing for the original sin of the United States, which had to do with enslaving African people. And so, I mean, he talks about an original sin. So he's a sinner and he absolves himself. How can you say that on the one hand and then talk about killing us and arresting us and putting us in prison, on the other hand, for taking on this issue, and then claim that the Russians had something to do with it? Maybe the Russians influenced Biden too. But so please go to handsoffuhuru.org. That's really important. And it's really important to sign on to see how you can support this campaign. We need you to be prepared to come out when indictments drop. We need for you to take certain kinds of actions. You can get that information going to handsoffuhuru.org. And we need money. Because, as I mentioned, it's a $270,000. I think we got $120,000 that we still have to raise to deal with that. And we need solidarity, which is extremely important. The United States government needs to know that that it is not doing this attack on us, behind the backs of the people, that the people have to see. If it's going to be a lynching, it's going to be a public lynching. And we invite you and your listeners and viewers to come to St. Louis. Get in touch with us. Go to handsoffuhuru.org and come and see what it is that we do so that you can see yourself who we are and what it is that we stand for. And having said that, Brother Danny and Comrade Sister Margaret, thank you so much for having us.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much, Omali. And you can find that link in the video description. Take care, Omali, and hopefully we'll be in touch soon.
Thank you very much.
All right, Margaret. So that was a great conversation. A lot to think about. So yeah, I mean, it's been a little bit. So everyone stick around. Hit that like button, share this stream. Of course, Margaret and I will continue on here probably for another 30 minutes or so. But Margaret, it's been a busy February, and part of a lot of things that Omali were saying definitely are relevant to what's been quite a hectic February around the world. I don't know, where should we begin? I mean, we had Biden's visit to Kiev.
Oh my God.
Wang Yi. We had Wang Yi go to Moscow. Now we have Janet Yellen in Kiev lecturing China. There's been a week-long lecture of China about this possibility of lethal aid. Ironically, 1-year anniversary since the, I guess you could say, open air hostilities of the proxy war with direct Russian involvement, Russia's special military operation. But I remember last year, the United States was just willfully saying we're giving lethal aid to the United States is giving lethal aid to Ukraine's government in order to prepare for the Russian invasion, which ended up being a military operation to do what Russia was asked to do in 2014. What's your take on all? I don't know. I'll let you take it from there. What's all that's been going on worldwide?
They give us so much material, don't they? But yes, last week was the 24th was the first anniversary of what Russia calls its special military operation. And I want everybody to understand that this war, this is just the latest phase of a war that began in 2014 when the Obama administration backed a right-wing coup in Ukraine, which resulted in a civil war in Ukraine. The people of the Donbass region did not want to be part of the coup government. They have been under attack ever since. Some 14,000 people have died in that conflict. There was a means of ending this, the Minsk agreements, but which were signed by France and Germany were guarantors along with Ukraine, and the agreement was received unanimous approval in the UN Security Council in 2015, but Ukraine never acted on the provisions of the Minsk agreement. Now, the former leaders of Germany and France, Angela Merkel and François Hollande, have said what you could have figured out for yourself, that it was always a sham. It was meant to help Ukraine arm. So there was never any serious work for peace. The U.S. was always using Ukraine to target Russia, whether it was for Ukraine to be in NATO or not. And also, they wanted to sever ties between Russia and Europe. Now, they succeeded in doing that, so that instead of having the natural gas from Russia, which made far more sense, that was a lot less expensive, now Germany is buying liquefied natural gas from the United States. What a surprise. And just in case they had any big ideas about being independent of the US, the United States blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. So at this point, militarily, anyone with any credibility is saying that Russia is winning. They have been all along. Ukraine has been aided by the US and Western European countries, so much so they're out of weapons. They're scrounging the world for weapons. The NATO nations don't have anything left to give. There's all this talk about tanks, which, you know, it's a months-long, sometimes years-long process to really learn to be an effective tank battalion. So it's a lot of nonsense. I'll make a long story short, a lot of war propaganda. So Biden goes to Kiev and their air raid sirens blaring.
Siren, that was such a joke.
And then they admit later in the day that Russia was well aware he was visiting and gave permission. So he had to ask Putin's permission.
So it was theater, and it was all theater. The siren was all just to create. I think Ukraine wanted to create some kind of scene and make it seem like there was danger while all the cameras were watching.
I think so too. And Biden wanted that also. So we have a new round of blue and yellow flags, and we'll stand by Ukraine. But to your point about China, China never said anything about arming Russia. So then the CIA guy goes on the Sunday talk shows and says, we have some confidence that we think China is considering giving weapons to Russia, which means it was all BS. But having said that, suppose they did. The U.S. feels like it can go halfway around the world and arm Ukraine. So what if they did? Even if it was true, and they bring up now all of a sudden it was pretty much dead in the news. COVID came from a lab. We don't know where COVID came from, but all of a sudden now that's in the news. And so it's beat up on China Week and Taiwan. And I say jokingly, although it's this very serious situation, they want to turn Taiwan into Ukraine and use it to get at China, but the results will be equally disastrous.
Yeah, if not more disastrous, given that with this, for me, I do not, regardless of whether there's some kind of halfway exit ramp or some kind of de-escalation of the conflict. Whether that happens or not, and it's quite plausible that it would, given Russia's superior position. It is quite plausible that we'll see a significant shift on the battlefield. I don't think we're going to see the overall war end. So anything that happens with regard to Taiwan and China in the United States, I think, is quadrupling its troop presence in Taiwan. There's been, I don't know how many reports since the new year about how there's war preparations. There needs to be war preparations. You had Mike Minahan of the U.S. Air Force leak a memo saying 2025, let's get ready to shoot for the head, aim for the head against China. So you obviously have a pretty significant section of the neocon establishment, the foreign policy establishment, wanting a war with China. And that will also mean, if such a thing were to occur, that there would also be a war with Russia, because that's not going to end. I don't buy for 1 second that the United States can kind of walk away with its hands empty and say, okay, we lost in Ukraine, NATO lost in Ukraine, we're going to stop. No, because we know that this is part of a process. This is part of an overall agenda. It's part of a national security strategy. The aiming at the head is not just toward China, it's also toward Russia. So I think that's what makes it so dangerous, is it will never be just one or the other. It's always going to be both. And with that said, it's also true that that this agenda is just it's ongoing, and the hypocrisy is there, and you see the hypocrisy straight up with exactly what you said, Margaret. The fact that China cannot even think about it can't even it didn't even state that it was going to, and I think that this is just a way to once again demonize China, make China to look like the bad guy, the big bad bully in the world. Meanwhile, as this was happening, China was at the Munich Security Conference. It was giving its idea of what it would mean to have a just global order. They had a whole global security initiative that they rolled out there. And then they also rolled out a peace plan process. Now, it was really more of a position paper. It wasn't saying that, Russia and Ukraine have to do XYZ, NATO has to do XYZ, but it was pretty concrete in the sense of where China stood, and that peace in negotiations had to be a huge part of whatever future is going to transpire and develop within this conflict. So all of that is to say is that you're right. If China wanted to send arms to Russia, it's right, especially if Russia wanted arms and Russia said, give us military grade weaponry, give us arms. Will you do it? And China said yes. Well, that would be well within its right, just like it was well within Russia's right to intervene in Syria when the Syrian government said, hey, can you help us out? We have all these invading forces. We have a huge NATO-led coalition bombing our country. Could you help us out and help us with these ground forces that are leaking into the country, armed with U.S. and NATO and Israeli weaponry? Help us out. It's well within Russia's right, just like it would be well within China's right. But China didn't even have to say or do anything. Just like the balloon incident, a couple weeks before that, all of this, I think, is just to create this hysterical response in the U.S. and in NATO countries, the NATO sphere, as to what is the agenda, what is the target, and who is the target. And it's China. And I think sometimes it feels like when things are going bad in Ukraine, that's when you see this huge pivot, at least in the public relations and the propaganda and the media, toward China. And I think that's what's happening here. It's been happening for quite a bit now. It feels like all of February has been that process taking place.
Yeah, it has. It's like, all they have is war. Things aren't going well when they ratchet up the war propaganda. And Blinken is going to Central Asian countries that used to be part of the Soviet Union, Kazakhstan, and I think Uzbekistan, to tell them they should, not be aligned with Russia, which is right next door to them and with which they have very friendly relations. It's, it would be funny if it were not so serious. But I noticed this weekend, people in Europe, there have been huge protests in London and Paris and in Berlin and in Italian cities. People are protesting against their governments, which have gone along with this mess, who have impoverished them, endangered their countries. Their leadership is not representative of them either. It's a interesting moment in history. All the countries that claim to be democracies are not, and show it in a variety of ways. We're supposed to hate China and Russia because they're authoritarian and dictatorships and so on and so on. But people in this country don't want I think it's now $113 billion to go to Ukraine, go to the military industrial complex mostly. And that's not something people here want. But there is none of the people who allegedly represent us will speak up on our behalf. I mean, to have no members a handful of Republicans, and I think it's funny, Republicans will allow some of their members some leeway for a short period of time. Democrats have total control and allow no one to deviate. But of all these congressional seats, how many is it? 435 in the country. There's not one district where most people want to say, hey, wait a minute, this isn't what I want. I find that very hard to believe. But that's what we were talking about in the previous conversation with Omali. These people are in crisis. They don't know what they should do. They don't have an out. So all they have is to do what they've been doing, even though it's not working for them. So that leaves the people of this country and people of the world in a predicament that we have these people controlling our lives who don't act in our interest, want us to shut up, and as they pursue ever more dangerous policies. So this blowing up of Nord Stream 2 and the silence from the media, silence from Congress, means that Biden can get away with doing something reckless and dangerous. And that, to me, is the most frightening thing right now.
Yeah, I mean, what the Biden administration has gotten away with, it's quite subtle. I think this is or at least it's quite subtle for those who aren't paying attention. I think what's been so just illuminating is how, we've had this process over the course of several administrations of this buildup towards shifting the strategy, the military strategy of the United States. And of course, right, it has dragged along its pack of dogs in Europe with it and NATO. But we've had this ongoing, it's been more than a decade now, of shifting focus and attention. The U.S. caused a lot of destruction all across the Middle East, the Arab world, the Muslim world. It caused, all kinds of destruction in Latin America. Of course, it played a huge role in the instability that Omali was talking about in Africa. And now it's looking at China and Russia as kind of, these are the next targets. This is how we maintain this unipolar hegemony, this superpower status. And Joe Biden's administration, it was campaigning back in 2020, you remember, as being the return to normal. But actually what Joe Biden has done is he's accelerated, I guess you could say, what is normal to these ruling elites, which is this constant warmongering and pushing to the more riskier conflict, because, well, that's all there is. How else are people in Washington who are pulling the levers like Victoria Nuland, how else are they going to reproduce their careers? How else are these giant banks and corporations, how are they going to ensure that dollar dominance continues and that they continue to get huge returns on their literal parasitic arrangements all over the world? How are they going to do that? Well, they need to make sure that China and Russia do not become powerful enough to challenge that, because they already are. I mean, Omali brought up Africa. It's so important. All this last month, you have Emmanuel Macron, you have Antony Blinken. They're just lecturing, African countries over and over. And this has been all 2022 as well. You need to follow the sanctions. Why aren't you following the sanctions? If you don't follow the sanctions, there'll be consequences. Lecturing some of the poorest countries in the world with governments that had, many of these governments had been at least compliant in some respects. They wanted U.S. investment. They wanted Western investment. They didn't get any. All they got was disinvestment in looting and plundering. And so Russia comes along and says, hey, seems like you have an unstable political and military situation. We can help you with that. China comes along and says, hey, we have all of this telecommunications infrastructure. We can help build your electrical grids. We can help build roads and all of that. We can show you the way, and then, you can have it, and, hopefully it'll help you too. And then you can help us, because the African continent is one of the richest places in the world. So, I mean, we are at this just juncture of history of just complete and total and utter, both irrationality, in the sense that everything that the United States does to maintain its superpower status backfires and blows right back at it and actually hurts its case. But also it's rational in the sense that this is how these people think. This is what they want. This is all that they feel like they can do to get what they want.
Yes, they don't know another way. And I mean, we've seen it unravel in the last year. Remember, they said they were going to turn the ruble to rubble because, all Russia has is gas and oil. And if they sanction that, that's going to be the end of Russia and it will collapse. Instead, we've seen more countries go into their sphere of influence. China and Russia are closer. And this was partly about China. They said, well, weaken Russia. China won't want to be their friend anymore. Although the two countries have to protect each other because they're both targets. So, of course, they've become closer. And no, they did not turn the ruble to rubble. Countries like India, they're buying Russian oil. Some of the European nations are buying Russian oil. They, will go from one ship to another ship, and they'll change a label, all kinds of things. But Russia is doing okay and weathered what could have been a terrible crisis. The U.S. has even ruined relationships with countries it was always friendly with. Saudi Arabia, they were trying to bully publicly. That's the other thing. These people are so amateurish, publicly bullying Saudi Arabia into pumping more oil, which of course would hurt Saudi Arabia. So the Saudis said, actually, no. So they welcome Xi Jinping, makes a state visit. It's a big deal. And that just shows you that they're flailing around. But you can't laugh at them because we know what they're capable of. And there are no nuclear treaties left. The U.S. has withdrawn or let expire all of these. So you have two major nuclear powers and no treaties currently, which is extremely dangerous. But they set us all up, or tried to set everybody up, with Russiagate. That was the purpose, was to give the U.S. a free hand and have people see, Russia as the evil place that you couldn't even talk to. And it's an unprovoked attack, unprovoked. And, it's like, no, it was provoked. And just in case people don't know what I'm talking about, they were instigating the Ukrainians to continue attacking Donbass and daring Russia not to help them. But even so, Russia was ready to talk. They were hoping to push Ukraine into talking to them. And they were talking, but the US and the UK scuttled those talks. So everybody who's died since that time, as far as I'm concerned, the blood is on US hands. Ukraine they are literally dragging men off the street, older men, teenage kids, dragging them off to the army, where they have a few weeks of training and then go to the front lines to get killed.
Democracy. It's the democracy of Ukraine just working its magic.
And so you have to look for the stuff yourself, of course, because the corporate media is no better at giving us information about this situation than they were a year ago. So I don't know what they're going to do. Are they going to abandon Ukraine after all of this? Are they going to do something crazy? Are they really going to try to fight two different superpowers at the same time? It's these are scary questions.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the more infuriating parts of this also that's happened not too long ago, actually, this past week. It's funny, the United States, as it continues this absolutely just counterproductive, also counterintuitive. It's very rational for the rulers of and these warmongers. Very rational in the sense that this is what they want. This is what they want Russia to be destabilized. But at the same time, everything they do actually has the opposite effect. So they thought, and I truly believe this, that they thought that the economic war was going to take down Russia. I don't believe actually that, even though there are significant elements inside of the US's military brass and in NATO who are thirsty to test out actually how big and bad their military is on a confrontation with Russia. I don't necessarily disagree that that is the case. What I disagree with is the thought that that was the primary strategy here. It's pretty obvious that in late February, March, when all these sanctions were being slapped on Russia, that what they were hoping for was that Ukraine's military would be strong enough to do just enough to ensure that the sanctions would then collapse the internal political situation in Russia. And the exact opposite occurred. You had a consolidation in Russia. You have more than 70 plus people. It was 80, 90 plus at one point, but still 70 plus people who are totally, not just a little supportive, not just somewhat, totally supportive of everything that Russia is doing. You have essentially a currency in the ruble, which was doing a lot worse before the sanctions. You have a Russian economy that is probably more resilient now because it has learned from China, it's learned from Iran, and there are ways that you can protect your economy from sanctions, and that's what they have done. And that's why they're going to grow more than Germany this year. It's because even though the pipeline was destroyed by the United States, Nord Stream, Russia has other options. Germany does not. And Germany doesn't have an economic system anymore that's willing to do anything except, I guess, kowtow to the United States' endless austerity regime. But the most infuriating thing that happened in my opinion, this week was Zelensky. So after China released the peace process, the peace position, of course, the U.S. media, the Western corporate media, the mainstream media said, it's not credible. No one should listen to this. China is actually just supporting Russia anyway. And oh, guess what? They might actually be looking to give weapons. So absolutely not credible. Ignore it. And of course, now you've had like Viktor Orban in Hungary, and you have a lot of countries say, oh, well, maybe we should pay attention to this because China actually does have credibility on the world stage. And then you had Zelensky comment on it. And I can't stand this guy. And one of the reasons I can't stand him is because he is this monstrous spawn of the United States and the foreign policy establishment, where they've given him so much power, too much in their opinion. I think that's why there's all this shuffling in Ukraine's government, because they're like, oh, we gotta like control this guy because this guy is out of control sometimes. He's like saying bomb away and Crimea and all that. You gotta pull him back a little bit. His people and he can be a little too much but they empowered him to be like this. And so he emboldenedly says, I'm visiting with Xi Jinping. And all of the Western corporate media outlets were like, Zelensky's going to meet with Xi Jinping. Zelensky's going to meet with Xi Jinping. And in my head, I was just like, he's not going to meet with Xi Jinping. Do you think the Chinese president would be caught for 1 second in a room with Zelensky, who has literally said he is against diplomacy? The United States and NATO have to drag him to just publicize that maybe he would be okay with talking to Russia at some point. This guy has built his entire political capital on being anti-Russia, on being an absolute just madman when it comes to the Donbass and when it comes to Ukrainian nationalism. And of course, we know what that really is, right? Being supportive of these fascist groups, being incredibly repressive. He's built his whole political capital on this. So him thinking that he's going to meet with Xi Jinping, who literally the Chinese government has put out a plan saying, number one is start peace negotiations? You think he's going to meet with you? The Russia is still saying that they're willing to have negotiations. And some people say, okay, well, Russia's learned its lesson. It's really not going to participate in that. But Russia has been willing from the beginning and into now, saying we will have it. But they just responded to this actually peace position plan and said, well, it's not there yet. We're not in this place yet to be able to respond to Chinese position paper. The media is trying to spin it as like, oh, Russia rejected the plan. No, they said we're not at that stage, and they're not. There's no stage here for peace negotiations.
It's interesting to me. A lot of this in this statement, it's what Russia was asking for a year and a half ago, in the end of 2021. They wanted to meet with the U.S. They wanted a security guarantee, and the Biden administration blew them off because they wanted a war. It's so funny with Zelensky. He's not stupid. He knows he's not going to meet with Xi Jinping. I think he does this sometimes to yank the U.S. chain, because in a way he can control them. I think sometimes he does these things just to say, you can't tell me what to do. Although ultimately he will do what the U.S. tells him to do.
Oh yeah.
So there's some little rivalries going on there, but the Russia and China are the grown-ups in the room, and they are the countries with maturity. They are the countries who can behave in a logical way. And I want to say too, and I know somebody's going to say, you think he's a nice guy? You think Putin's a nice guy? Or no, none of them are nice. We're not talking about nice people. We're talking about state power. We're talking about power politics. But if you just compare them to the U.S., in fact, China and Russia, to their detriment, spend a long time trying to get along with the U.S., but you can't placate a bully. You just get bullied all the more. And now they know that they cannot trust the U.S. at all. They know they cannot have a relationship at all. Russia knows that they've washed their hands of the European countries. Angela Merkel talked Putin into the Nord Stream project. So, Xi Jinping, he's no fool either. So they are striving. The Chinese, he's not the foreign minister anymore, Wang Yi, who's in the Politburo. He's the head foreign policy person. He was just in Moscow, met directly with Putin. And Xi Jinping is going to Moscow. So they are planning to try to do what they can to protect themselves from the U.S. And thank goodness, we need a multipolar world. We need countries that can keep the U.S. in check. So that is not something to be feared. That is something to applaud.
Yeah, and we need breathing room for the nightmare that we live in here. I mean, we're both in the United States. Not all of our viewers are in the United States, but we are in the United States, and anyone who's in the US and Europe too. Oftentimes, I think there's this romanticism. I think Ukraine has blown the lid. The proxy war has blown the lid off of this romanticism of Europe. EU Foreign Policy Chief Joseph Borrell's garden, right? Europe is the garden, and the whole world, the white man's burden, right? The whole world is a jungle that needs to be tamed. Well, I think Ukraine and NATO's war in Ukraine has really blown the lid off of this romanticism of Europe, because in fact, a lot of what's happening in Europe is very similar to the United States in terms of just everything internally crumbling, economically, politically, socially. There's just so much dislocation, and conditions are worsening. And I think that this multipolar world hopefully can open up some room so that there is more of a possibility for a situation like what happened with East Palestine to get its proper attention, and rather than the United States kind of stealing this public relations moment on President's Day and going to Kiev and Biden hobnobbing with Zelensky while people are being poisoned right in the real backyard of the United States, or at least as it is constituted at this moment. Given Omali has good points, it is a colonial content situation, so it is still stolen land. But at the same time, the fact that people in East Palestine who have been poisoned, living in this just absolute nightmarish condition, which is not unlike what so many people are living under all across the United States, maybe without the train derailment. But nonetheless, it's just, yeah, the crises that are happening internally. There's this internal rot in the United States and in the West. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that these countries are aligned in all the wrong areas. They're aligned on endless war and on endless plunder of wealth, of the wealth of working people, and all the people that they want to oppress. They want to plunder and loot them until until they go, and then they hope their spawn will do the same thing.
Yes, you're absolutely right. But it can't go on forever. We don't know what that means, how long it's going to be, how the rest of the world will respond. But we know for sure this situation is untenable and it can't go on.
So I know we're at the 90-minute mark, so maybe we can close up here. Before everyone goes, shout out to everyone in the chat, all the moderators for coming out tonight, everyone in the chat. Before you go, if you haven't yet, drop a like, hit the subscribe button. Make sure you subscribe to this channel, notifications bell. Check out all the links in the description as well and ways to support. Margaret, do you have any final thoughts? Anything that you want to talk about? Plug?
Tomorrow's Wednesday. Wednesday's Black Agenda Report Day. blackagendareport.com. We have always have a new issue every week. So check out Black Agenda Report tomorrow.
Cool. Well, all right, everyone. I will see you again soon. Thank you so much, Margaret, for joining me tonight. And take good care, and be sure to hit all of those things that we mentioned before you leave here, after you leave here. Take good care. Bye-bye.